The unthinkable has finally materialized within the cold, stone walls of the palace. Prince William, the heir who has long balanced the weight of the crown with the silence of a brother, has drawn an irreversible line in the sand. This wasn't a decision born of a sudden burst of anger. It arrived with a sense of finality that has been building for years behind closed doors. In the early hours of a morning that the public will remember as a turning point, William signed a decree, a document that effectively ends Prince Harry's last remaining royal tie. This wasn't just a health update or a routine statement. It was a system reaching its breaking point. For years, the monarchy has managed the optics, trying to control a reality that was rapidly fracturing. They sold the image of a perfect family while hiding a truth that Charles, now battling his own illness, could no longer manage alone. William has stepped into the role of the enforcer, the man who must choose the institution over his own flesh and blood. As he gripped the pen, the emotional language that once dominated conversations about Harry was stripped away, replaced by a cold, institutional reality. The message is surgical, calm, and impossible to ignore. The monarchy does not just manage feelings, it manages perception, and that is where the survival of the crown begins. You didn't just watch a royal update today, you watched a future king decide that compassion without limits becomes weakness. This decree strips away the last of the illusions. It is the execution of the monarchy's most sacred and brutal rule: service over sentiment. For those watching from the outside, it may look like a family feud, but for those inside the machine, it is a legacy integrity memo written in ink that cannot be erased. Silence in a family is one thing, but silence in a public institution is another. And tonight, that silence has been replaced by the definitive click of a door snapping shut forever. The decision did not arrive in a burst of anger or a sudden fit of royal pique. Instead, it arrived quietly, heavily, and with a sense of finality that had been building for years behind the thick, ancient walls of Windsor Castle. In the early hours before the world awoke to the news, a closed-door briefing took place, a meeting of senior aides, legal advisors, and a king who appeared exhausted but fundamentally resolute. There was no room for sentiment in that room. The air was thick with the cold reality of institutional survival. The discussion was brief, not because the issues were simple, but because the conclusion was already a foregone certainty. Files were laid out, old promises revisited, and for the first time in recent history, the emotional language that once dominated every conversation about Prince Harry was surgically stripped away. What remained was not a father's grief, but a monarch's duty. The palace machine was no longer looking for a bridge to build. It was looking for a way to cauterize a wound that threatened to infect the entire body of the crown. Throughout the night, phones rang non-stop between palace officials and the Home Office. Lines were crossed, and voices were raised as the urgency of the situation became unmistakable. Harry's latest overseas media appearance had landed like a grenade in the middle of a fragile recovery, reopening wounds the monarchy had desperately tried to heal. Once again, private grievances had been weaponized as public tools, and for the Prince of Wales, the limit of tolerance had been reached. For Prince William, this was the final betrayal in a long line of perceived transgressions. Every interview and every accusation felt like a step further away from the core values of the crown, values that require sacrifice and silence over personal narrative. The monarchy has survived scandals and wars, but it cannot survive being hollowed out from within by its own members. William, acting as the architect of this new era, realized that the gears of the royal machine were grinding to a halt. If the gears aren't fixed now, the entire institution risks collapsing under the weight of its own unresolved drama. Behind the finality of the royal decree stood a figure who has long been regarded as the crown's iron backbone, Princess Anne. Known for her stoic resolve and lack of interest in the glamour of the spotlight, it was her private report that ultimately ignited the reckoning the House of Windsor could no longer delay. Anne had watched the escalating crisis with a surgical calmness, and in the quiet of her own chambers, she commissioned what became known as the Legacy Integrity Memo. This was not a document born of family emotion, but of lethal precision, designed to expose the mounting cost of royal mercy. The numbers contained within the memo were staggering and impossible to ignore. It provided a detailed audit, laying out in brutal clarity a £175 million burden left behind by the Sussex's various security deployments, travel expenses, and logistical failures stemming from last-minute cancellations. All of these costs were being quietly paid out of the royal estate's discretionary funds, effectively the money of the British people. In the margin of the final page, Anne reportedly scrawled a single, devastating phrase: "This is a betrayal of the taxpayer." Anne made her position clear through conviction rather than complaint. She argued behind closed doors that the monarchy could no longer claim moral high ground while privately funding the chaos that undermined it. It was during a session with the Privy Council that she uttered the words that would change everything. "Silence isn't loyalty, it's complicity." These 6 words rippled through the monarchy like thunder, forcing a shift from passive containment to an active, cold recalibration. The Lord Chamberlain, initially reluctant to escalate internal family matters to a constitutional alert level, found himself moved by Anne's unshakable assessment. He agreed that protection and titles must be earned through public duty, stating that you cannot protect what is actively working to undermine you. This report removed the last shield of sentimentality from King Charles's eyes. Every policy previously bent out of guilt was now viewed as a crack in the institution Anne had sworn to protect. As whispers regarding King Charles's declining health grew into a deafening roar within the palace walls, a chilling truth began to emerge. This royal decree was not merely a legal filing, it was likely his final major act as a sovereign with the strength to enforce it. For months, royal observers had noted the king appearing thinner, quieter in meetings, and increasingly absent from the traditional splendor of public life. He was not just battling the immense weight of the crown, he was reportedly racing against his own physical limits. According to those in his inner circle, fatigue had become a constant companion, yet Charles refused to slow down. He told a senior aide, in a voice crackling with exhaustion, "There are debts I cannot leave unpaid, not to the country, and certainly not to the crown." The term unpaid debts echoed through the halls of the palace as the Sussex crisis transitioned from a family discomfort into an existential threat. The turning point arrived during an unannounced solo visit to the Balmoral estate, the very place where Queen Elizabeth II had once navigated constitutional firestorms with a steady, unflinching hand. Charles arrived without an entourage, without the usual machinery of the court. He sought the Highland solitude to find what years of media noise had drowned out: clarity. Walking the same paths his mother once tread, he reviewed notes in the late Queen's own hand concerning duty, precedent, and the fatal price of overextended compassion. It was there, amidst the cold Scottish mist, that he realized sentimentality had become a corrosive force within the institution. The final catalyst came not from London, but from across the Atlantic. Reports of Meghan's latest remarks, which many perceived as a subtle jab at the late Queen's legacy, reached the king while he was in seclusion. For Charles, this was the boundary. It was no longer about personal slights. It was about the desecration of the memory of the woman who had defined the monarchy for 70 years. That night, the king did not sleep. He sat amongst a mountain of printed memos and legal drafts, neither eating nor speaking. When the first light of dawn broke over the Highlands, his mind was made. The order was given with a chilling finality. "This is duty, not family," he reportedly whispered as he reached for the revocation papers. There was no rage in his movements, only a profound, somber resolve. He knew his time as an active sovereign was a finite resource, and he refused to let history record him as the monarch who stood by while tradition was hollowed out from within by his own blood. As the ink dried on the decree, the father in him may have grieved, but the king had finally spoken. The door was not just closed, it was locked from the inside. When the news of the royal decree reached the sun-drenched coast of California, the atmosphere inside the Sussex estate did not resemble a revolution. It resembled a funeral for a brand. Prince Harry was reportedly stunned into a deafening silence. For someone who had spent years crafting a narrative of liberation and finding freedom, The reality of being surgically removed from the institution was a blow that bypassed politics and struck at the very core of his identity. This wasn't just a man responding to a shift in UK law. This was a son realizing he had been stripped of his name, his standing, and his safety net. Sources close to the couple describe a scene of profound disorientation. While the world outside debated the legality of the king's move, inside the Montecito walls, the Sussex machine was scrambling. Meghan's PR team, known for its swift pivots and aggressive counter-narratives, reportedly went into a state of frantic overdrive. Friendly journalists were activated, press statements were drafted and redrafted, and interviews were abruptly postponed. But for the first time, the wave was too high to ride. The story wasn't just trending. It was dominating the global conversation in a way that left no room for their usual victim narrative. Public sentiment, once fueled by curiosity and sympathy, had turned cold, hardened by the revelation of the mounting financial debts and the perceived betrayal of a sick king. The fallout quickly moved from the personal to the corporate. In the high-stakes world of Hollywood and global branding, royal was the USP, the unique selling point that commanded multi-million-dollar contracts. As the decree severed the last institutional tie, the royal sheen vanished. Internal memos from major streaming giants like Netflix reportedly reflected a sudden optics shift. Brand partnerships that were once eager to market off royal prestige began to reevaluate their contracts, viewing the Sussex name no longer as an elite asset, but as a reputational risk. What was once the most sought-after branding in the world was becoming a liability in real time. Perhaps the most haunting detail of this internal collapse came not from the lawyers or the PR agents, but from the nursery. Reports surfaced of a former staff member witnessing a moment where young Archie asked a simple, innocent question that sliced through the chaos. Why can't we go back home? For Harry, that inquiry was an echo of everything he had lost: his country, his military bonds, and the very ground he once stood on. As Meghan moved to control the damage, Harry grew increasingly withdrawn, pacing the coastline alone, disconnected from the very world they had fought so hard to build. The dream of a rival court in America hadn't just stalled. It had been dismantled by a single stroke of a pen in London. While the halls of Montecito were filled with the silent despair of a crumbling brand, the streets of London and the rural heartlands of the UK were vibrating with a very different energy. The British public had finally been given the say they had craved for years, and their message was thunderous. This wasn't the divided nation the media often portrayed. Instead, it was a resounding affirmation of tradition over spectacle. In the days following the announcement of William's irreversible decree, the silent majority found its voice, and that voice was one of overwhelming support for the hardline stance taken by the future king. The data captured in the immediate aftermath was staggering, sending shockwaves through newsrooms from Fleet Street to Manhattan. Polls conducted within 48 hours revealed a clarity that left seasoned political analysts stunned. A massive 69% of UK residents voiced their full, unhesitating support for the final removal of the Sussexes' remaining titles and privileges. This wasn't a vote driven by cruelty or malice. It was a collective decision to protect something the public deemed sacred. For the British people, the monarchy is not a reality show to be consumed and critiqued. It is a mirror of national identity. By signing that decree, William hadn't just ended a family dispute. He had performed a bold recalibration that the nation felt was long overdue. Inside Parliament, the sentiment was equally sharp. MPs from across the political spectrum, who had previously tiptoed around the royal drama to avoid controversy, suddenly found the courage to speak. One senior minister described the moment as the day the crown reclaimed its spine. The consensus was clear. The public was exhausted by the endless cycle of royal soap operas and victim narratives. They wanted a sovereign who stood for something absolute. The narrative of the modern monarchy was being rewritten in real time, no longer as a flexible institution trying to please everyone, but as a firm, principled authority that understood the difference between bloodline and service. The media reaction highlighted a profound cultural rift. While some American outlets labeled the move as exile under a velvet glove, The British press overwhelmingly applauded the move as an act of institutional survival. The digital realm echoed this sentiment. Platforms like TikTok and X were flooded with tributes to the hardline monarchy, contrasting the stoic resolve of William and Anne with the perceived entitlement of the Sussexes. Montage clips of the late Queen's most disciplined moments began trending again, used as a yardstick to measure this new era. The message from the ground was undeniable. The people weren't mourning a lost prince. They were celebrating a king in waiting who finally had the courage to say, "Enough." The signing of the royal decree was not merely a symbolic gesture. It was the activation of a cold, mechanical process designed to erase a prince from the institutional memory of the crown. Behind the carved oak doors of a quiet legal chamber within the palace, a document lay waiting. Its name carried the weight of centuries, the Royal Warrant of Revocation. In modern royal history, few had ever seen it, and even fewer had dared to use it. But as Prince William stood by his father's side, the machinery of the monarchy began its work with surgical precision. This was the final execution, the moment where Duke and Duchess became footnotes in a legal archive. The wording of the decree was clinical and unflinching. There were no flowery justifications or room for future negotiation. It stripped Prince Harry not just of his security privileges, but of every institutional right associated with active royal service. From ceremonial honors to diplomatic entitlements, every tie was severed. The palace was no longer whispering. It was acting with a cold clarity that left the Sussex legal team reeling. The timing was a masterpiece of strategic diversion, scheduled to align with a major public event to ensure the nation's focus remained on the splendor of the crown, while the dirty work of revocation was handled in the shadows. By nightfall, the digital world reflected this new reality. The official royal website, the gateway to the monarchy's global image, was updated with a speed that felt like a purge. Bios were shortened, links were broken, and the titles that once carried the illusion of permanence, Duke and Duchess of Sussex, were removed from active registries. Most symbolically, the heraldic records, the ancient ledgers of blood and title, were altered. The ducal identifiers bestowed upon Harry and Meghan were effectively ghosted from the current roles of honor. It was a digital and physical scrubbing of a legacy, leaving behind only the civilian labels of Mr. and Mrs. Inside the palace, some constitutional advisors were reportedly shaken by the severity. They warned that such an act would echo through generations, shaping the very definition of royal lineage. But the leadership was resolved. This was the nuclear option of the monarchy, a reassertion of boundaries that had been ignored for too long. The message to the world was clear. Lineage is not enough. Service defines royalty, and without it, the titles are nothing more than ink on paper. The royal sheen had been wiped clean, and for the first time in his life, Harry was truly on the outside, looking in at an institution that no longer recognized his name. While the world focused on the clinical precision of legal documents and the shifting tides of public opinion, a much quieter, more painful reality was unfolding within the private quarters of the royal residences. Beyond the grand tapestries and the rigid protocols of the staterooms, the human cost of the irreversible decree began to set in. Among the palace staff, the valets, the dressers, and the protection officers who have spent decades in the shadow of the throne, the atmosphere was one of raw, unspoken mourning. This was not the celebratory mood found in the tabloids. It was the heavy silence of a family house that had just lost a son for the second time. For many of these long-serving members of the royal household, Prince Harry was not just a headline or a reputational risk. He was the boy they had watched grow up in the wake of Princess Diana's tragic passing. They remembered the mischievous child in the corridors of Kensington Palace and the grieving teenager who walked behind his mother's coffin. To them, the severance of his royal ties felt like the final, violent snapping of a bond they had spent 20 years trying to preserve. Reports surfaced of tears quietly shed behind closed doors, not out of defiance to King Charles or Prince William, but out of a deep, personal sense of loss for the boy Harry once was. The conflict of loyalty within the palace walls was palpable. These are men and women whose lives are defined by their devotion to the crown. Yet they found themselves caught between their institutional duty and their personal affection. The legacy integrity memo may have proven the financial burden of the Sussexes, but it couldn't account for the emotional weight felt by those who had served Harry since his youth. They saw the nuclear option as a tragic necessity, a surgical move that saved the patient but cost a limb. One senior staff member reportedly remarked that while the crown had reclaimed its spine, it had shattered its heart in the process. This internal grief was further complicated by the haunting shadow of Princess Diana. In the eyes of many veteran courtiers, this final rupture represented the ultimate failure to protect the fragile bonds she had left behind. Every time a portrait was moved or an official record was updated to reflect the revocation, it felt like a fresh wound. The palace has survived abdications and wars, but this modern divorce of a prince from his heritage carries a unique kind of sorrow. Even as the royal machine continues to grind forward, the quiet sobs in the staff quarters serve as a reminder that behind the iron exterior of the monarchy, the scars of this betrayal will likely never fully heal. While the palace mourns the loss of a brother and a son, Prince William is looking toward a horizon that Harry can no longer see. This irreversible decree is not merely a reaction to current drama. It is the first definitive architectural drawing of William's future reign. The Prince of Wales has long been a student of institutional survival, and through this act of unprecedented strength, he is redefining what it means to be a modern monarch. For William, the era of celebrity royalty, where titles are used as leverage for media deals and personal branding, is officially over. He is ushering in the era of the meritocratic monarchy, where the crown is a reward for service, not a birthright for the entitled. Those who have analyzed William's recent moves see a man who has learned the most brutal lesson of his father's early reign: that ambiguity is the enemy of the crown. By leading the charge on this decree, William has sent a chilling message to every member of the royal family, present and future. He is signaling that under his watch, the slimmed-down monarchy isn't just about reducing the number of people on the balcony. It's about a radical integrity audit. William's vision is surgical. He believes that for the monarchy to survive another 1,000 years in a skeptical, modern world, it must be beyond reproach. It must be an institution of high-performance public service, and anyone who threatens that performance, no matter how close the blood tie, must be removed for the safety of the whole. This shift in strategy represents a profound departure from the never complain, never explain mantra of his grandmother. William's approach is more proactive. Define the boundary before someone else defines it for you. He has watched the Sussexes attempt to build a rival court in California, a shadow monarchy that profits from the very institution it criticizes. By cutting Harry's last royal tie, William has effectively dismantled that rival power structure. He is making it clear that there is only one source of royal authority, and it flows from the service of the crown in London, not from a production studio in Montecito. In the eyes of constitutional historians, this is the moment William ceased being a prince and started acting like a king in waiting. He has shown that he possesses the cold clarity required to make the most agonizing decisions. To William, this decree is a protective shield around the future of his own children, Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis. He is ensuring that the institution they inherit is clean, focused, and free from the corrosive soap opera of the previous decade. The royal sheen is being replaced by a royal steel, and as the ink on the decree settles into the archives of history, the world is catching its first glimpse of a king who will choose the crown every single time. The ink is now dry, and the silence that has followed the strike is perhaps the most telling sign of all. The House of Windsor has undergone a surgical transformation, one that has left a permanent scar on the lineage of the Mountbatten Windsors. As the Duke and Duchess of Sussex fade into the civilian reality of Mr. and Mrs., the world is left with a chilling question. Did this act of unprecedented strength save the monarchy, or did it create a wound that will haunt the crown for centuries to come? By cutting Harry's last royal tie, William and Charles have prioritized the stability of the institution over the sanctity of the family, choosing a steely survival that many believe was the only path left. Yet, as the palace celebrates a rebirth through rejection, the emotional shrapnel continues to fall. For Harry, The loss is total. His country, his military identity, and his institutional purpose have been dismantled by the very hands that once held him. For the crown, the victory is bittersweet. They have successfully removed a source of constant friction, but they have also lost a part of their own history. The permanent scar is not just Harry's to bear. It belongs to a monarchy that has proven it can be as cold as the stone walls that house it. This decree has turned the page on a decade of drama, but history is a long and unforgiving judge. Only time will tell if this was the salvation of a 1,000-year-old dynasty or the beginning of a slow, lonely isolation. The crown endures, as it always must, but it does so today with a heavier heart and a much thinner bloodline.